Welcome to episode 4 of the Max Term podcast. Kyle Stitch here along with James Finch. Today's episode, we're talking about the goalie market. As usual, we're providing our opinions. These are not necessarily, we're not passing along any inside information that we might have or anything like that. Any ads or anything associated with this podcast don't necessarily reflect products that we're endorsing or our views or anything like that. We'd appreciate you subscribing to the podcast on any of the channels that you might get consuming our podcast from, as well as following us on Twitter at MaxTermPod or at AFP Analytics, which is where we have our contract projections posted. And any questions or anything, you're always welcome to reach out to us via any of those channels. So the goalie market is an interesting one. And it's really interesting because the name we have at the top of our projections is restricted free agent. But I'm not sure that RFA is going to stand the entire offseason here.
It'll be an interesting situation for the Toronto Maple Leafs and Ilya Samsonov. He could very well be their goalie, whether it's on something close to his qualifying offer, which is $1.8 million. Or if they go long-term with him, which is a possibility. We have him projected 4 years at about $5 million. That's 5.99% of the cap. It's going to be interesting because of their cap situation. He's a decent goalie. You worry a little bit about injuries. Could they possibly replace him with a cheaper option? Maybe, maybe not. All of that uncertainty around how they're going to build their team out leads to the uncertainty of what happens with Samsonov. I don't think there's one answer that I gravitate towards.
Yeah, I kind of hinted at. I would assume they qualify him, but maybe if the minute they qualify him, they're kind of backing themselves into a corner just based on just asset wise. Still have Matt Murray under contract. Maybe they buy him out to create a little bit of cap space. I like Woll. I like Joseph Woll as a prospect, but is he ready to take on a full-time role in Toronto? Maybe as a backup type player. Does it make sense to have him in tandem with Samsonov? Do you want to play hardball with Samsonov and basically force him into, well, probably go to arbitration, and who knows where that award could end up.
Exactly, and I do want to be clear, Samsonov's UFA year starts next year. So if he were to be on a one-year deal, it would walk him right to unrestricted free agency in the following offseason. So I don't see that as a likely outcome of this. I think Toronto is going to be smarter than that to just give up on an asset in a way like that.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if Toronto doesn't qualify him. That might come as a surprise to some of the listeners, but the minute they qualify him or basically want to retain his rights, they want to keep the ability to sign him, he's probably going to turn around and file for player-elected arbitration, which is going to allow him to present his case in front of a neutral, basically, arbitrator, and that arbitrator is going to decide how much he's going to make. I would be surprised in an arbitration case if he comes in anything under $4 million, which is the kind of level Robin Leonard set years ago with Buffalo. And Samsonov had a better season than Leonard did and got that $4 million.
Yeah, I think it's something Toronto's really going to have to decide. It's how do they want to build their team? Are there cheaper options out there that could possibly make more sense when they're trying to sign other players? I don't want to go too far down this road because it's pure speculation, but could someone like a Carter Hart, a possible trade, make more sense? And then that leads to Samsonov either being moved as an RFA or not qualified. I don't know. It's a strange situation to be looking at our top free agent goalie and to be so uncertain about how he's going to be viewed by his current team.
Yeah, let's stick with the restricted guys a little bit more because there's interesting names kind of towards the top of the list. Like most of the quality in the goalie market are those young guys. And cover your ears, Ottawa fans. Philip Gustafson is the next RFA. We have him projected for a really nice contract after he had a great year being traded for Cam Talbot.
Yeah, so we've got Gustafson at a 3-year deal, 4.25 AAV and a 5.08% cap hit percentage. That is technically our long-term projection for Gustafson. He had a great season for Minnesota, and he looks like their goalie number one of the future, and even of the now. I think he's kind of surpassed Fleury in Minnesota. And for Ottawa, that's a tough trade when you're looking at Cam Talbot. And I guess in a way it could make sense back then when they made the trade. They wanted the veteran goalie who had some experience in the playoffs and had played well in recent years, but that trade just looks bad now.
Yeah, Minnesota has a similar situation to Toronto in that they have a kind of older young goalie in that someone that's coming close to unrestricted free agent, but still a restricted free agent. Then they have a goalie that played with their AHL team that's thought of pretty highly in Jesper Wallstedt. So it'll be interesting kind of how Minnesota wants to position themselves contract-wise. And that's not even considering what they may or may not be doing with Marc-Andre Fleury, too.
Yeah, it's definitely another team to watch as far as a restricted free agent. I would assume Minnesota would want to keep him, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that it's definitely happening. And even the type of deal. So long term is what we went over, but we've also got a short term deal for him, and that's coming in 1 year at about 3.15 AAV, and that's a 3.79% cap hit percentage. And I don't know if that really makes sense for Minnesota from just a salary cap perspective. I think the longer term deal would make sense to try to get him locked up a little bit. It's just a weird top of the market for goalies this year.
Yeah, and then a couple more, not really many more RFAs that are looking to get paid. I mean, Mackenzie Blackwood, I would be absolutely shocked if he does get qualified, so I'm expecting him to hit the open market. Connor Ingram's an interesting kind of name as well. He could go either way with Arizona, but then there's not really many other names.
One big one you might have scanned
I missed.
Jeremy Swayman. And to continue this is a weird year for restricted free agent goalies. I don't know if anyone is confident in what Boston is going to do with their goalie situation. Ullmark just had an amazing year. Jeremy Swayman's a very good young goaltender that could easily be the goalie of the future for Boston. Could be the goalie of the future for many other teams too. I don't know if that would mean a possible offer sheet. Those don't happen very often. It might more mean a trade could be possible. But is it Swayman in a trade or Ullmark in a trade?
Yeah, I'm gonna throw the water on the offer sheet fire with Jeremy Swayman and just point out that the minute Boston, I would assume, files for arbitration, that takes the offer sheet ability off the table. So if I was a team, I would love to throw an offer sheet just right around that second round, third round compensation, around that $4 million range, which is right around where we have them projected, and that would put Boston in a very uncomfortable situation. So I'm assuming Boston will file for arbitration. But just like we started off talking about Samsonov and using the Robin Leonard comparison, like Swayman in arbitration is probably getting $4 million as well. So has Boston established enough of kind of a contract culture, if you will, of players taking a little bit below what they're probably worth to kind of help build out depth on that team and in that organization.
Yeah, I think maybe they have built that culture. I also kind of wonder, just from Boston's perspective, as far as how much cap space they may need to sign other players. Is this a tough decision that they make? Because Olmark's there at $5 million, and Swayman, if he comes in just under $4, $9 million isn't crazy, especially for those two goalies. But they need the money elsewhere. You're talking Bertuzzi, Orlov, Hathaway, Bergeron might retire, Krejci might retire. That team's going to have a lot of holes, and that cap space is needed. Really tough situation to predict.
Yeah, so the RFA, not many names, and even the unrestricted class. I think there's some guys, if you're looking for kind of a 1A, 1B type of player, there's definitely no like, hey, let's ride this guy for 50, 60 games. I think most of these guys in the unrestricted class, you're probably topping out close to a 50-50 split, 40 games each for one goalie, 40 games for your other on your roster. I think the one name that maybe is a little bit closer to the ride him a little bit more goalie is Tristan Jarry. So he's a player that Pittsburgh is fans have kind of grown a little bit tired of, but he's still a quality goalie. He's just dealt with a lot of injuries, so there's some risk there. And I think it would be really interesting to kind of talk a little bit about how we came up with that 4 years, almost $5 million projection for Jarry, because as we've been saying in a lot of our previous episodes, our goal is to create a market basket of players that are similar, so we kind of have a higher scenario, a middle scenario, which is around where they'll sign, and a low scenario for Jarry. So some of those players would be who?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you 3 names that kind of all have a similar playing history of there's been a little bit of injuries here and there. They've looked like they can pretty much take over being the top goalie, but there is a little doubt there. So the low side of our projection, so our projection was a 4-year deal, 5.78% on the cap hit percentage, and so a lower side comp for Jarry is going to be Freddie Anderson when he signed in Carolina. That was a 2-year deal, 5.45% of the cap. Similar situation where Anderson flashes and has the ability, and had it when he signed that contract, to be a top goalie, but there were questions about, can he sustain it over a full season? Someone who falls a little bit above at 5.96% was Ben Bishop when he signed his deal with Dallas. That was a 6-year deal, so a little bit of a longer deal, 5.96% cap hit percentage. And then just above him, Robin Lehner with Vegas. So that was a 5-year deal, 6.06%. These are all guys that injury questions are there. The talent's there. It's kind of finding the right balance of how much risk are you willing to take on.
Yeah, so if this is your first time listening and you're hearing us throw around kind of percent of the cap a lot, episode 1 of this Max Term podcast, we touch on kind of why we use percent of cap and kind of how our projections come about. And I think it's also important when looking at kind of the names that we have on the goalie list and some of the numbers associated with them, to point out that these were finalized before the playoffs were over. Which will bring me to who we have as the third goalie in the unrestricted class. But I'm going to go off script a little bit, or at least off our projections, and say I think now probably the second goalie in Aiden Hill, who I think there's 2 strong comparisons that didn't necessarily that factored into this projection, but now we're looking probably a little bit more at because of how the playoff run happened, and that's Jordan Binnington's shorter term deal with St. Louis right after they had won the Cup, and the second goalie, Scott Darling, who had a run with Chicago a few more years ago. But both Binnington and Darling's contracts were really driven by strong playoff performances. So that would bring Adin Hill's value probably above $4 million, which would put him around, and I think might even exceed where we have Freddie Anderson's deal. So Adin Hill's definitely a goalie to watch. Personally, he's been one of my, I don't know, under the radar favorite kind of ideas for teams looking for a depth goalie for a couple of years. So be interesting to see if he can replicate that success, but he's always been kind of a favorite of mine.
So yeah, those two goalies we mentioned as comparables, Binnington and Darling, we did actually have them as comparables, but they were at the very top for Adin Hill, not necessarily someone that he fell in with originally. But yeah, the playoff run is probably going to push him a bit north above our projection.
Then once we get past Hill, who be interesting to see what type of market develops as a team going to bring him in as a true 1A type of goalie or a kind of 1B. We have the Carolina tandem, Freddie Anderson, Antti Raanta, who are probably the other kind of 1A, 1B options. And maybe I throw in Jonas Korpisalo, who we have projected a little bit lower value-wise, but I think teams could talk themselves into him if LA doesn't necessarily retain him.
Yeah, so I'll start with Korpisalo because he's separate from the two Carolina guys. He had a bounce-back season, so much so that the Kings needed a goalie and they acquired him, but didn't have the greatest playoff. And that recency bias that I think creeps in, I think it's going to hurt him a little bit on the open market, especially when he had some down seasons prior to this. So we've got him at 2 years, about 2.6 AAV, and I think that's probably fair. Moving to the Carolina guys, this is an interesting, which goalie would you rather have? So the way I look at it is, I think if I needed one game or maybe one playoff series, give me Antti Raanta. But I'm looking for a solid goalie play over a full season. I might be more comfortable going with Freddie Anderson. They both have some injury questions, but I think at this point Anderson's a little more durable than Raanta. I think it really depends on what you're looking for. I think Anderson can be a 1A. I think Raanta probably tops out at a 1B.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking kind of 1A, 1B, we're talking kind of guys that are playing maybe 45 games as a 1A and just under 40, maybe 35-ish as a 1B. Just kind of the 1B would be more of the complementary piece, while the 1A gets maybe a few more starts. But basically what Carolina rolled out this year is exactly that type of situation where they have that 1A and 1B, or at least ideally they wanted to roll that out. And Carolina might bring back one, but definitely not bringing back both because they have prospects in the pipeline as well. But after we get through those kind of guys here, we get to the Cam Talbots, the Martin Jones, the James Reimers of the world, who are veteran guys who have been around for a while, but have not really put up inspiring numbers lately. Oh, and I guess I can throw Jonathan Quick into that category as well.
Yeah, so at this point, all of those guys are backups. I guess if you're a team that's looking to not win very much, maybe you sign Martin Jones because he can still play a decent amount of games. He's durable, but he's going to give you probably at best a backup level of play. And even then, some of those guys that were just mentioned, the Talbot, Jones, Reimer, Quick. Even of the backups available, those are the guys that I might kind of steer clear from. They might be a little bit more on the wrong side of their career. Um, if I was targeting some backups, I'd probably be looking at like an Anthony Stolars from Anaheim. He's a little bit younger. He's 29. He's been a solid backup behind Gibson. Um, I would even have a little bit of interest in Alex Stalock if you think he can stay healthy and even just give you 20 games as a backup. He was serviceable in Chicago on a team that was very, very bad in front of their goalie. And then a fun one, because of the end of the regular season, would be Alex Lyon from Florida. Curious to see the situation in Florida with Bobrovsky. It's really an unknown kind of the situation going on with Spencer Knight, whether or not he'll be returning soon. That's to be seen. Lyon could just stick there and be insurance for Florida, but after what he showed in the regular season, he might be able to find an opportunity to have for sure backup minutes somewhere.
Yeah, I think Alex Lyon, if you're trying to talk yourself into someone, you look a little bit at Eric Comrie last offseason signing with Buffalo, who had a very small sample size, but in some of those games was in that small sample size prior to signing that contract was very, very good. And I think a team could easily talk themselves, especially when we're talking some of these other names on the list. I agree. I'd rather roll the dice on a Lyon, or even maybe journeyman Jarl Halak at this point. He's a backup, but he can. I would feel comfortable putting him in games that my star number one isn't playing. But the thing with him is I think I'm limiting him to 20, 30. I think 30 even is too many. Probably around 20 games a season, and there's not many goalies that are playing 60-plus games in a regular season anymore.
I think where he's been in New York, with the Rangers specifically, behind Shesterkin, that's one of your few examples. Right there in New York with them, the Islanders, there's Semyon Varlamov, who I think is probably more capable of playing a bigger role still. I don't know if he leaves the Islanders. He seems to be pretty happy, and the team seems to be pretty happy having him behind Sorokin.
Yeah, I kind of glossed over that name for that exact reason. I looked at Semyon Varlamov, and I'm kind of assuming that he's staying with the Islanders and that they'll work out some sort of deal. We have what we think his market value is, but he's someone on this list that I would not be surprised takes a little less money to just stay in a comfortable situation. He's made some really good money in his career at this point. He's comfortable. He's playing with his countrymen, and he's got a good role on a team that makes it easy on their goalies. So I personally don't think that he's supposed to be unrestricted free agent, but my guess is he signs back in the island, even if it's kind of Lou Lamoriello style, where they wait until September to actually sign those contracts.
Absolutely, and I do want to touch on the countrymen comment, because one, I would say, still a contender that in theory could make some sense for someone like Varlamov or Halak if they were to leave their respective teams, is the Tampa Bay Lightning. They have Vasilevsky. He could use, I think, a little bit more of a breather at this point than he usually has been getting. Brian Elliott, I don't know if he's really cutting it as the backup at this point. I still don't know if it would be enough of a situation to pull those other two goalies, Varlamov and Halak, out of their current situations, but it's something I'm kind of speculating. It would be an interesting fit.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of guys who might be interesting fits that we've already talked about, Alex Lyon could stay in the state of Florida and just move a little bit Northwest there and relocate to Tampa, and he could probably eat a few more games and give them probably better quality play than what they got last year because yeah, Tampa's a team that their starting goalie and Vasilevsky definitely needs a little bit. Seems like he needs a little bit more of a breather. And this year they finished fairly comfortably in third, but there's some teams behind them that they need to be careful of that could easily catch them if they're basically punting on 20 games a year with a backup goalie. Florida, who were just in the Stanley Cup Finals, absolutely could sneak past them. And then you have Buffalo, Ottawa, and Detroit, who are building some young, talented teams there. I would be really afraid of both Buffalo and Ottawa if I'm Tampa Bay. And then Florida, I think, can easily pass them as well.
Yeah, I think a last point to make with Tampa Bay and their goalie situation. Vasilevsky has played a lot of games in the past half decade. Um, so just in this past year, he had 66 total games, regular season playoffs. The year before, 86. The year before that, 65. Before that, 77. At some point, I feel like he's going to break down if they don't get him a little bit more help.
Yeah, so really the goalie market, if you're really looking for someone, I don't know, Samsonov, if he hits the open market, Jari, if he hits the open market, that's about it. That's about it.
Yeah, if you need a clear starter, you're going to have a tough time in free agency.
If you are looking for a goalie, I think you're looking in the trade market. And there's a couple names that have been out there.
Yeah, so I would start with Connor Hellebuck because that seems like a for sure move that is going to be happening. I believe it's been reported that he has told Winnipeg he is not signing an extension with them. That he's a top, I will say top 5, but you could argue above that goalie in the NHL right now. He's obviously a clear starter. Then there's someone, and I don't know if he's as much available. It might take a huge offer. There's Jussi Saros from Nashville. Great goalie. Still has some term left on his deal, but I don't know if I wouldn't move him yet. I don't think if I'm Nashville. Carter Hart's a name for Philadelphia, who seems to be listening on pretty much everyone on their roster at this point. There's still some questions of if he is a true number 1. He might be more of a 1A type of goalie, but there's still some potential there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Hellebuck's the obvious name there. This year, contract's pretty manageable to fit in, especially I don't know if Winnipeg's going to be willing to retain, but if they're going to tear things down a little bit or at all, they're probably going to have the space to maybe retain to even increase that value at all.
Yeah, I think as far as a trade cost, it's going to depend on how Winnipeg looks at this. If they let teams talk extension before a deal is actually made. As far as a team acquiring him, it depends on the specific situation, but I think an extension for him, you're going to be looking at a max term deal most likely, and you're looking in the 9s probably. He's going to want to be at the top of the goalie market, and I think expecting or hoping that he would sign a 3-year deal or something like that. If I'm him, absolutely not. He's going into age, or his new contract would be for his age 31 season. So if he were to hit UFA next year, he's going to look to cash in and get his last big deal.
Yeah, I think you might be able to talk yourself into him as a pure rental and even talk him into that idea. Come on to our team. let's put something up in front of, let's put a good team around you. You can put up some good numbers, put up some wins, hopefully make a playoff run, and then you can go pick your destination. You can go get paid. You should have the numbers to do so. And depending on what that salary cap is, yeah, anything under $9 million for an extension just seems absolutely insane unless he kind of forces his way to one team and gives up a level of leverage in that negotiation. I don't see a scenario where Hellebuyck does not get probably at least $72 million on his next max term contract.
Absolutely, and I think that will be a huge factor in who is interested, but also I think who he is really interested in going and playing for. That'll be something we'll have to wait and see how that shakes out. The other extension candidate that we mentioned there was Carter Hart, and he'll have a QO next year, a qualifying offer that's just under $4.5 million. I don't think that is really likely. I think a long-term deal would end up happening, and you're probably looking at the 4-year mark, around $5 million at that point. But if I'm Carter Hart, I'm not signing an extension this year. I'm going to try to play out this coming year and have it be another stronger year and up my value a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's not just Carter Hart. I think a lot of players, unless the team's going to blow that player out of the water, I think you're giving up a level of leverage by not waiting until you see the next salary cap, because this $1 million rise is not doing it. So if you're going to kind of lock yourself into long-term deals now, you might be doing it at a long-term discount for the team. If you don't have to sign a contract, and unless the team's going to blow you away, I just wait. So the Hellebucks, the Harts, even I know UC Saros is another name we talked about there as well. If I'm a team, he's probably the name that I'm most interested in, but I don't understand why Nashville quite is ready to move him. I know they have Askarov in the pipelines, but it's tough to move a top caliber goalie for a prospect who's been fine in the AHL, has a strong pedigree, but hasn't played an NHL game really yet.
Yeah, I think with Nashville, it's kind of a situation. I don't know if this would be how they view it, but if they move Saros, it kind of feels like they're throwing in the towel and would need to do at least a little bit of a reset with their team, because you have a clear number one goalie with no real replacement yet. Askarov's coming. He should be very good. You don't know for sure. He hasn't played in the NHL, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, Nashville with Saros, and he's not even that old either, is you trade him away, you are really saying we're tearing it down, and I don't know why he's not a piece that I'm moving unless you really are trying to get to the top of the draft. And I don't know if Nashville would really have to make some more moves to do that as well, because they have a decent roster kind of around him as well.
The other thing with Nashville, and it's hard because they've kind of been one of these in-between teams the past couple of years, since they made their long playoff push a few years ago. Roman Jossi's, he's 33 right now. They've got Ryan McDonough on their roster. He's 34. Some of their top forwards, Matt Duchene, 32. Ryan Johansson, 30. You move Jussi Saros, you might not have a true number one goalie for a few years, and by the time you have that, let's say it's Askarov and he establishes himself as a top goalie in 2 or 3 years, you don't know what your top players are going to be looking like. You might have missed your window.
I mean, you could argue that they already missed their window, but that's a discussion probably for another kind of look on another podcast that we'll have and hopefully in the future for you. The goalie market's definitely kind of an interesting one. It's probably going to be a lot calmer this year than in the last couple years, where I think the last couple of years there were lots of moving parts, lots of teams trying to find a 1A, 1B type of guy. But I think we're at the point where there's spots for these goalies to play, but there aren't as many as in the past. I think a lot more teams are pretty okay with where they're at. So it'll be really interesting to kind of see what happens there, and whether maybe there is a little bit of a trickle down with some of these RFAs signing and how it might impact the rest of the organizational depth. With that, we'd like to thank you for listening to the Max Term podcast. If you have any questions or anything, we'd appreciate letting us know. You can follow us on Twitter at MaxTermPod. You can follow at AFP Analytics, where we tweet out our contract projections and kind of analysis as contracts are signed, and you can direct any of your questions to that. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.